Hey there, and welcome to Checkbox Other, the podcast that celebrates people who don't fit in a defined box or category. I'm your host, Nikki Innocent. I'm a humanity activist that focuses on centering stories of unheard voices and creating safe space to have connection and difficult conversation. I am really excited about today's episode, but before we kick that off, I have a couple logistical things and elements outside the podcast that I want to make sure that I share here. So first of all, thank you so much to everyone that sent good vibes for my TEDx Bentley talk that happened earlier this month. It went great, and I am looking forward to being able to share the final YouTube video with you all on my social media feeds. If you don't want to wait for that final video, I actually have the live stream available on my social media feeds as well. Or if you don't have social media and you're interested in taking a look, you can go over to my Linktree account. That's at linktr.ee/Nikki Innocent, and it's the first button on there. It actually fast forwards up until my point during that event. But if you want to watch all of the wonderful speakers, you can definitely take a listen and a watch to the whole event itself. It was a wonderful day. Staying on that TEDx train, I have a TEDx talk at Boston University on April 26th. As I mentioned in the previous episode, it sold out in mere hours, and there's this long wait list. But the good news is that I am doing a ticket giveaway over on my Instagram feed. So if you are interested in joining the 300 of us that'll be in that room, please do head over there and take a look at the contest rules. I will be picking the winner on Monday, April 22nd. And then finally, I have been having so many great conversations for future episodes, so I realized I should probably tell you when those can be expected to drop. New episodes will be dropped on the first and third Friday of each month. And if that changes, keep a listen here or an eye over on social media and I will let you know. Now, let's get to today's episode. My guest today is Courtney Sharpe. She's the Director of Cultural Planning for the Mayor of Boston's Office of Arts and Culture. Courtney's journey spans across various regions of the United States and around the world. She grew up thinking that she was going to be a U.S. ambassador, but found during her travels that the domestic needs here in the U.S. are a perfect fit for the gifts that she has to offer. Courtney and I met in March of 2017 at an event put on by the mayor's office, and this was way before she had an idea that she was going to be working there. The event centered around encouraging the women of Massachusetts to run for office. It was a panel discussion of so many strong women that had run for office in Massachusetts and in Boston before. Courtney and I ended up sitting next to each other. We struck up a conversation, and the rest is history. During the episode, we covered topics that growing up, I didn't really have a place or a person to talk about them with. We talk about quitting, and quitting especially when things are no longer working or serving you. We talk about race, things like exceptionalism, historic American symbols that have racial ties. We talk about whiteness in America, and we talk about race and diversity in Boston. Since Courtney and I are both elder millennials, we also touched on what we think the world will look like as millennials step into more leadership positions, and what is necessary in order for us to get to a place where our economy provides equitable experiences for the diverse set of millennials and Gen Zers that are coming up the pipeline. We really talk about so many more topics like immigration and so on, so be sure to take a listen to the full episode. One of the things that I also want to mention from a logistical perspective is that we had a little bit of an issue with one of our mics. You'll hear some rustling and interference around the 25th and 30th marks, and they last for about 2.5 minutes at a time. I would recommend to turn the volume down and maybe take one of your earbuds out if it's too much to handle. I encourage you to stick through because the conversation during that time is so incredible. The topics that we continue to cover throughout the whole episode are worth having a listen to. So thanks in advance for dealing with the amateur skills of my editing here. Let's get this episode started. Hey, Courtney.
Hi.
Thank you so much for hopping on and joining me for the podcast this time around. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. I was telling people about the way that we met and how it felt like fate brought us together sitting next to each other in that wonderfully historic room in Faneuil Hall to make more women run for office and to make change. And I felt like I was sitting next to one of those wonderfully powerful women that were making change, and I didn't even know how much so. And then I got to know you even more, and now I've gotten to know you even more by doing my own little stalking, and I'm like, yep, universe.
Yes, I'm glad we met. I remember when we got lunch and we were dressed alike.
It's like, okay, I get it. Thanks. I was supposed to meet this woman. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, well, I feel like the best way to kick this off is to hear a little bit more about you, a little bit about your journey, kind of what got you to where you are right now, what you feel like have been pivotal moments in your life that have either shaped you as a person or shaped your path.
Okay. Well, I guess I can start by saying where I am now, maybe work my way backwards a bit. So, I am the Director of Cultural Planning in the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture for the City of Boston. So, folks often are like, well, what's cultural planning? And that's a good question. I think my brief answer for what it is the combination of urban planning and arts and culture. So it's looking at the assets and resources within a particular neighborhood and trying to amplify the cultural assets there, which really is the people, and making sure that there are enough resources for maintaining the identity and helping the identity grow as the people and residents really want it to happen. I've been in this role since August.
I fanned out really hard on social media when I saw that you got this job. I was so excited for you. Oh.
I'm flattered. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what about this particular job is exciting for you. What about even, this doesn't even need to be about your job, anything about your life that brought you to Boston, anything along those lines?
I first came to Boston a little while ago now. It's amazing how time flies. I first arrived in the area summer of 2014. I came for grad school. I was studying at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I was a student in urban planning. And that was a fabulous time. And I was living in Somerville. Yeah, I had a great time in grad school. I really loved the environment, classmates. It was a very lucky experience.
And had you been to Boston before coming to school here? Because I know, where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Washington, D.C., but I grew up mostly in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. So,
cool.
Where's home? I guess my bedroom for now. It's constantly being moved more and more towards a guest room, but that's in Texas.
Okay. Thanks, guys. I'll come and sleep here, but, where's my stuff that was up on the wall?
Basically, yes.
Very cool. Very cool. And I know before coming to grad school, you had done a lot of work internationally. Am I right?
Yeah, so after I graduated from undergrad, I went to Morocco and I was doing Peace Corps there. So I was there 2009 to 2011, and that was definitely a different experience. I had spent some time studying abroad as an undergrad, but this was my first time of like a year plus actually living abroad. So I was a youth development volunteer, which could mean different things in different countries, but in Morocco, that primarily meant doing English teaching.
Okay. Very cool. And were there a lot of people there with you through the Peace Corps?
Yes and no. So technically, Morocco at the time was the second largest country in terms of Peace Corps volunteers. However, the way they do it is that, with the exceptions of married couples, usually volunteers are in sites all by themselves. So throughout the country, yes, but in our individual sites, no.
Wow, I did not know that. That's very cool, and also must have been such an interesting experience internally as well, I'm sure.
Yes.
And so how you were there for a year, you mentioned, a little over a year?
I was there for almost 2 years. I was there for 20 months.
Wow, that's so cool. So you were in schools teaching English?
So in my particular community, it was a Darshabab, which is a house of youth, so like a youth center. But it was interesting in that their Darshabab center had been more of like a community auditorium, and they were switching it to be more of the traditional use of like a youth center. And so I came at that time, and so it was basically a startup of trying to figure out how to get students to come. And there were a lot of weather problems and government problems. So I actually wound up not teaching there for a period of time, and then teaching in the middle school for a little bit of time, and then switching back, and lots of startup issues.
Yeah, right? I mean, yeah, you're like, it was a thing that was new for me, just going to a new country and getting settled and all of that. And it was new for all of us. So there was a lot of new beginnings. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's crazy. That's really cool. So what do you feel like was the biggest thing that you took away from that experience in Morocco and the Peace Corps there?
I think the biggest thing I took away is that sometimes it's okay to quit. I know this might be a somewhat controversial-ish statement, but I actually had a really difficult time there for reasons that were not particular to the community so much as organizational structure within Peace Corps. And I say this because I think it's worth saying, like, I really believe in Peace Corps. I believe in the mission. For those of you who don't know, they really have three key goals. The first is to like go and be a good representative of America and be an ambassador. The second one is to impart technical skills and wisdom. That's like what people think you're there to do. And then the third is to do what's actually called third goal, is when you come back to America to really bring back the lessons you learned in the culture of the place you were with. And so it's like spreading the mission, or not the mission, but like the cultural awareness of whatever community you were in. And so third goal is like a huge thing. I think for me, it was interesting doing Peace Corps because as a volunteer, the organization really talks a lot about the technical skills and like what are the quantifiable things that you're doing. But 2 out of 3 goals are really soft skills, and it's about the ambassadorship and building the relationships. And that's like what makes Peace Corps so enduring. But what I say, I think one of the lessons I learned was that it's okay to quit, is that I experienced a lot of, I guess, logistical challenges where I was like caught in between things. And it felt really personally hard for me. It was a time I was coming out of undergrad, a young adult, and I had lots of imposter syndrome. I had lots of feelings of inadequacy, and I was also somewhat socially isolated, but I stayed. So I have full rights to say I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer, but it was very hard. Being able to find a social network in whatever context you're in is like very important in making sure that like for your emotional health to really take care of that. And I feel like giving yourself permission to change course is like really important, because like I know sometimes we set these goals like I have to do XYZ thing by Y date, and if I don't, then I'm a failure. It's like, no. Circumstances can change. You could just decide you want to do something else, and that's fine. Like, do what actually is like best for your health, and don't worry about what other people think so much.
Yeah, no, I'm so happy. The way you even started that answer is something that I wish was a more common thing that people said. I think there is, I personally can say from my experience of leaving jobs / quitting jobs, or even I actually quit the soccer team in college. And that was one of the most difficult things I had done. It was such a huge core part of my identity. And there was so much shame that I had associated with the idea of becoming a quitter, quote unquote. And there is so much liberation that we lose in living in that shame, that you actually, when you're quitting something, it's because there's a part of it that wasn't working. And for some reason, we are so good at trying so hard to make things work that don't, that when they don't end up working and we knew a long time ago they weren't, we blame it on ourselves. So I think it's such a beautiful thing to say, and to be able to recognize it coming out of undergrad, that's a young age to recognize that stuff too. I think that's wonderful, truly.
Well, I'll say it, there was a lot of hindsight, as at the time it felt really terrible, and I did not want to leave. I really wanted to stick it out, because the way Peace Corps works is 3 months of preparation and training, and then 2 years of service. So 27 months is a normal service, and I left at month 20. And that was like a real emotional struggle for me, but I was like, I really need to leave. But I stayed a part of the Peace Corps community, because another thing I learned, I'll say, is maximize your network. I like, don't do anything that's not genuine, but if you are a part of something and it matters to you, then stay connected. So when I came back to the States, I went back to Chicago, like near where I went to undergrad, became very involved in the Chicago Area Peace Corps Association. And I really found friends that were wonderful and found community. And that's been great.
That's amazing. I'm just going to add another part of what you mentioned when you were giving the three goals, that the 2 soft skills are really the things that transferred for longer, for your memory, for your experience, and then continued your relationship with the Peace Corps afterwards. You weren't part of that because you were super excited about the technicalities of it all. You were excited to keep in touch with the great people that were working towards the similar goals that you were, and that were really looking to make change, however they were able to do that. The reason I left that process of continuing to do what on paper looks right was that I felt like the soft skill part of it, and really the humanity of it, if you cut through all the jargon that we use, the humanity of stuff gets lost when we're trying to be so overly productive and we're trying to hit the results of things. I think there is so much value in the connections that you're making with people, whether you planned for that to be how it goes down or not. So I just want to talk a little bit about urban planning. And I know you mentioned urban planning and the kind of intersection of culture and the identity of the neighborhoods that you're working in. Can you talk a little bit about some concrete examples of what that looks like? So in something like Boston Creates, I know that there are a bunch of pillars within that program to get more involved with communities and to really bring arts and culture to the forefront. So I'd love to hear a little bit how that comes about, and maybe even how, from your startup experience in Morocco, how that might be something very similar. I feel like you're doing such great work bringing more initiatives to the communities in and around Boston.
One of the examples that comes to mind is, so Imagine Boston 2030 is the city's first plan for the city itself in, I think, 50 years. And one of the things it called out was an arts and innovation district, and piloting that starting with Upham's Corner. So Upham's Corner, we've been doing a lot of community engagement for, about a year and a half, maybe closer to 2 years now, that's really looking at the district itself. And it's self-identified as having a very strong arts and cultural identity. And so we, the city, and various departments within it, including economic development, Department of Neighborhood. So lots of departments that comprise the city of Boston have been partnering with the Boston Planning and Development Agency and the nonprofit DS&I to really come together to put out RFPs, requests for proposals, for 3 different pieces of land. So 3 distinct sites that are centered in Upham's Corner. And so that's really exciting because all 3 sites are supposed to have a cohesive arts and innovation feel that to really build out the arts and innovation district. And so one of the more complicated and exciting parts of it is that one of the sites includes the Strand Theater, which is like a 1918 vaudeville theater is what it was originally created as. And then it like transferred over time. It became like a performance theater. And in the middle, let's say the 70s, 80s, the city of Boston acquired it because it had fallen to a period of disuse. And so we've been maintaining it. And so part of this RFP is that we're looking for a new operator for it. That's really exciting. So that's one part of this site. And this site, we're also looking to create a brand new library for Upham's Corner. Because, the current one is in a building that wasn't built to be a library. The children's section is in a former pool. So it's like, no, we want a purpose-built library for Upham's Corner. Yeah. And then one of the really cool things we're considering as a part of it is also doing housing. So a mixed-use library that has housing above or somewhere in the site. So that's some of the things we're doing. So like looking at how we could integrate housing into different sorts of artistic uses. And across all of these sites, we're doing like a 20% artist set aside so that there'll be housing like specifically designed for artists, in addition to doing 2/3 affordability. So that's like a third, like a third low income, middle income, and market rate.
Right. And you said 20% artists?
Yes.
Oh, very cool. And so that would be and that was in the library you mentioned when it would be the idea of that was the housing in the library, or in all housing that's going on around there. That's the hope, is that there's going to be bringing more artists in housing developments around there.
Yes. Across all 3 sites that these joint partners, the city, the BPDA, and the nonprofit are putting out, that 20% of the housing units that come out of it would be set aside for artists.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I'm working on. Another thing, so the city, for those of you who are not in Boston listening, we have very high real estate prices. So we're basically experiencing a housing crisis, but it also impacts the affordability of commercial spaces. So one of the things we're working on is developing artist live work guidelines that basically are design guidebook for how to come up with different typologies of space for ground up purpose built buildings to house artists and allow them adequate space to do whatever their respective crafts may be. And so one thing we're excited about, or why we wanted to do it this way, is, well, there's lots of reasons. One is that we're seeing across the city more development that wants to include different units for artists, which we're super excited about, but people aren't necessarily sure how to do it. So we're like, okay, here's some guidelines to help you do it well. But the other reason that's really compelling about doing artist live workspace together is that the government in various forms has lots of ways to fund housing, but not as many to fund workspace. But if the workspace is incorporated into the actual housing rather than separate or apart from it, then that can have some sort of like cross-subsidization going on because it's part of the actual apartment, let's say, rather than a separate building someplace else.
Right. Wow. That's very cool. And genius at the same time. I was thinking when you were talking about the housing that would be with the library, how it's kind of like built-in story time. It's like a beautiful opportunity to have access to so much knowledge in what would be, it's not really your basement, right? But would be right downstairs. That's such a great
I would
opportunity.
love to live above the library. Like one of my legitimate favorite places in Boston is the main branch of the Boston Public Library. It's just so wonderful. Like the city actually has like book clubs, like the BPL has book clubs. It's just so great. I'm in this club.
Well, I saw that you're in a few book clubs, right?
Yes. 2019 has been hard to me in terms of keeping up, but yes, there's one out of BPL I really love. Fantastic books and where to find them. I guess the Harry Potter fans will pitch the reference. I lead a book club for my sororities, the alumni group, and then the city hall itself has a book club for its employees. So those are 3. And then I'm also involved with the Harvard Club, and I haven't necessarily been to the book club meetings, but I sometimes read along with them because they meet Friday mornings at 8, and I'm like, but they pick really good books.
8 o'clock in the morning for me is like, I don't, no one wants to be around me at that point. Definitely not having intellectual conversation. So right as you say that, I'm like, girl, no more. You don't have to say anymore. I know. That's amazing. I am not much of a reader per se by like a handheld book. It sounds so silly, but I have learned that I love listening to books. So I have become like an Audible junkie, and I've been using the BPL's Libby app, which allows you to actually listen to books. And I find it so wonderful. I kind of feel like I need to be moving my body a bit, and I absorb a lot better. And it's been a wonderful way. It's like an awakening in a certain way. It's an education in another way that you can really kind of get into a story. I kind of wish there was a Audible book club version that I could kind of tap into. I wonder, I should check that out and see if they have one at the library there.
I've actually never listened to a recorded book.
I know there are some people that hate it, so I'm going to give that. It might not be for everyone. I have a hard time sitting still sometimes. So even being able to like walk or to like clean as I do it, I feel like I get a bit more in the story. Even driving, it's been a delight for me, but that's just me. You know, there's some people, I know my sister is not a fan. So there are other aspects of urban planning that I'm so intrigued by. And I think a lot of both the work that you're doing, but also the content that you're putting out in the world and kind of how you're using your voice has been around how social justice plays into the current state of where we are in the world. Part of the whole storytelling is really giving a holistic experience in that idea of artists have their space that's made for them, and it's really accessible for you to get knowledge and information in the ways that work best for you. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you view the work you're doing and how it can make an impact on the larger city of Boston. And it sounds like a lot of people are asking for models of how you do create spaces that actually incorporate artists' work, how you think of this work that you're doing that can hopefully be replicated in other places.
So the state has a program, Mass Cultural Council, which has established cultural districts as a program. And so if a cultural district is designated, it has a state designation as a cultural district. So across the state, there are 40 odd some cultural districts, and the city of Boston has 4. And this is something we've been thinking about recently. So we haven't traditionally been that involved in cultural districts, which is totally our bad. We were supposed to have been. So now we're in a place of reevaluating what the program is. And we're kind of unique in that we're a very large city, and a lot of cities in Boston are not nearly as large. So trying to figure out what the role of cultural districts should be. Like we have 4. If 4 is the right number, then we probably don't have the right districts exactly, which means we should probably have more because we like the districts that we do have. So currently we have Fenway, the Latin Quarter, which is High Jackson Square. We have Roxbury, which is centered around Dudley Square. And we have the Literary District, which is centered kind of downtown and around the Common. And so one of the things we're really looking at is how can we make this program more robust? So part of the way it's set up now is that in other cities in the Commonwealth, the cultural districts can be a combination or some variation of like the city's arts and cultural board, or they can be an arm of economic development, but they're really made for like small towns. But again, that's not our reality. So we've been thinking, where can we go from here and what can we do to make the program more robust and more beneficial for the members? So my office has been in conversation with the Office of Small Business Development to see what can we do? Is there a way we can grow this program? And I think from my perspective, I like the idea of cultural districts because Boston doesn't necessarily have the greatest reputation when it comes to race relations, depending on who you're talking to. And so I mean, maybe that's an understatement.
Yeah.
But I mean, the fact is, Boston is 53% people of color. And
Mm,
so there is a lot of diversity that's already here. And
right.
so, what I would like to see is a way for us to elevate the presence of the diversity that already exists. We don't need to import diversity. We
Right.
don't need to make up stories. We just need to like more accurately tell the world who we are. And so I
Yes.
think that by providing more resources to cultural districts, and these are ongoing conversations, but as we work this out, I think that could really be a way to make a network that, well, a network among different neighborhoods, but also a platform to more easily display when people come from out of town, or maybe even for people who have lived here their whole lives, maybe just to get
Right.
out and see something different. So, really trying to make the program more robust so it's an easier infrastructure to share with other people. I know infrastructure is kind of a wonky way to talk about it, but I'm like, well, how can we get all the services to all the places, and how can we easily share the word, whatever it is we're trying to say?
Right.
Like, how can we get people to know and see? And so I think that can really be an exciting path forward.
Definitely. I think there is this whole idea of where are the obstacles, both in sharing the stories of the people that are doing the great work and making this culture the culture that we have. And then also, what are the barriers for people actually accessing that information? As Bostonians, as people in Massachusetts, sometimes we don't have access to that information one click away. I mean, we're also
Mhm.
very used to not having to do that much work to get the information in front of us, right? So how do we make that communication, that information so easily accessible, and in a way that it feels like, oh, I just stumbled upon something that was right around the corner. It was so easy, because it really is. There is so much that's around you that we don't see. We walk around with these blinders on of the
Yes.
process that we go through every day, or we kind of follow those same footsteps to work every day and don't look up and see what's around us. And so there is so much beauty in providing a platform for the great work and the incredible people and really the diversity that is in this city to shine. I think that is such a beautiful a beautiful goal slash a beacon to be moving towards. I will say that in one of the diversity and inclusion workshops that I did, it was actually around sourcing diverse candidates. And one of the questions was, how do we bring more diverse candidates to Boston with the reputation that we have? And I mean, that's a tough question. I think a lot of people would be like, yes, if you can give me a 30-second, like give me an elevator pitch on how we do that, there'd be, there would be a lot of people nodding and happy to hear the 1, 2, 3 step of it. But it really is this whole idea of, actually, we don't need to bring people into Boston necessarily. We have a lot of people here. It's just that
Right.
they're not getting the exposure that they deserve. They're not necessarily
Right.
getting the opportunities that they deserve here either. And so it's this whole idea of shining a light where light hasn't been shown before on the beauty that we have and the diversity that we already have here, rather than sticking to that kind of old vibe of, we just don't have very many people of color here. Whereas, I
Hmm.
mean, you're like 53%, excuse me.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pivot a little bit on this, but I think they're similar. And I personally got like chills in my body reading some of your blog posts and some of your social media posts around talking a bit about how our societal constructs are set up and the challenges that have separated various groups or various sides of an issue. And I thought you did such a beautiful job. Specifically, you talked a lot about the experience of Black people in America, and you pair that with Jews in America and the Jewish experience overall. And I think there's such a beauty in the way you bring forth conversation that can be very difficult and very emotionally charged to bring people together. There's such a beautiful intersection that I think you you do it in like a paragraph. I was like, how did you just, people have tried this for years. How'd you just do that? So I'd love to hear what your experience has been, one, kind of creating that content, and two, the reaction that people have had and the conversations that you've started. There were two pieces that I just read. There was one that you talked about the various members of the Jewish faith and community and the different beliefs in that space, which I thought was incredible. And then you had another space that was talking about anti-Semitism and how it's not, people think it's no longer a thing, but it's a thing.
Ah.
And so I read those, which I thought was amazing. And then I saw on your social media, you had posted about this whole idea of people's reaction to what happened in Christchurch and what happened in Pittsburgh and what happens in Black communities, and that there's this feeling of there's never enough. There's never enough reaction or emotion or sadness or sorrow. There's so much more than we know because we're not necessarily the people that have been impacted directly. And so in these conversations, that there is this ongoing dialogue that's not necessarily making it to the public discourse in the Black community of very similar experiences that don't necessarily get the platform or the exposure that they deserve.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was experiencing was after, I guess it was after the shooting at Tree of Life, seeing a lot of friends of mine post on Facebook questions about whether or not non-Jews had reached out to comfort. And that to me was very interesting. So I should also say, for those who don't know me, I am Jewish and I'm also Black. And so sitting between these two communities and having exposure in both, like a step in both places or two steps in both places, and hearing different conversations. And it was really interesting to me, the question of, well, did anyone check in on me from outside the community from a Black perspective? Because I feel like let's say in recent times, there have been so many instances of police brutality that have made national news and many that have not.
Right.
There have been so many instances of nosy neighbors involving police that did not need to involve the police, and no one really reaching out, let alone all the rest of American history. And so I felt it was really interesting, this question of, when do you reach out? Do you reach out because it's something that is considered an abnormality? Do we have empathy fatigue? At what point do we decide we should check in on someone? If we assume that it's part of the Black condition that the Black community will experience some sort of injustice, then maybe people don't reach out. But in the 21st century, if it's crazy to see a mass act of anti-Semitism, which it should be crazy, we do not want to see more of this, then what's the threshold? What does it mean about us as a society that some things we have seemingly accepted as par for the course? Like, do we need to recalibrate and say, no, this is unacceptable and that's unacceptable and this other thing is unacceptable too, and to always show up and care? And maybe if we always show up, then collectively, when we reduce our tolerance for things that are not right, maybe we'll speak up more and demand better from our society.
Yes. If we had the language, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Black, that we get used to saying that's not okay here. That's not okay to do with my fellow human.
Yes.
Not because I am Black or I am Jewish, I am human. Yeah,
yes. And I would love for us to get to that place. Everything's a lot these days. We can certainly do better. What does it take? I know personally, something that I feel really helpless about is, I guess my whole existence is political, but to get political, the border, the children, the separation, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And I really don't know what to do about it besides voting, but that seems very slow and feels so unsatisfying. And I feel that I'm probably not alone in that, but it is on my mind and I don't know what to do.
I'll say I don't have the answer, but I will say that I think there is so much to be said for starting a conversation, especially as you're talking about empathy fatigue. I think there's a little bit of that, but I also think that once things get so uncomfortable, a lot of times we just shut off the conversation. And we see it for the 140 characters in one of our feeds and we feel an emotion for a moment, but we're able to turn off our phones. We're able to shut our computers and it doesn't impact us if we're not on that border or we're not feeling that experience. But there is this whole idea of having it part of your daily life, that it is a real thing that's happening all the time for people. And just because you are removed by distance or by familial experience or by the identity buckets that you get to check off, that it actually doesn't hit you as close. It's bringing it back to consciousness awareness that, hey, it might not be happening for you today, but it is happening to us as a larger human race, right? So I do think, though it might feel like, okay, I'll vote and I only get to do that every once in a while. And does my vote matter because most of the people around me here in Massachusetts might be voting the same way I am? There is this part of like, even the smallest stuff you do, you never know how much you're going to motivate people who might be able to amplify that message, or even just the space for conversation where a lot of people don't have that, whether it's in their home or at work. God, that's a whole different place. But just providing the space for people to actually let their minds think about things rather than seeing it, feeling some extreme emotion, then shutting off. I went to an event this weekend and one of the people speaking at the event actually shared his experience of being an immigrant in America and his struggle with getting a visa to work here. He has done everything he needed to do. He has been an incredible student. He is wonderful at his job. He has done all the paperwork. His family isn't in America. Coming to and from America is difficult. They don't get to see each other a lot. And it's this whole idea that the immigrant experience isn't something that people look at enough to really understand the ins and outs, and how looking for a job isn't the same for him as it is for all the other candidates go in for the interview and they press yes on the US citizen box and they get everything they need, right? So it's this idea of just bringing it to the consciousness of everyone around you. You know, you never know whose ear gets piqued in that moment.
I had a friend who was here for grad school and he graduated. This friend was from another country. When he was job hunting, he had the right status and he started working, but then it expired and he reapplied and it took months and you never knew from like, when did it come? The next day, the next week, and it took like 3 months. It's not a way that you would want to live your life, to be like, can I work? Can I get paid? It's just this instability. For other populations, you also have racism or Islamophobia. I had a coworker who was telling me about an experience that she had with folks in her family where she was at an event where one of her very dear friends was there who is Muslim, and some of her in-laws like met this person and they really liked her. But the friend of my friend was married to someone who was from a country where there was a Muslim ban and he was in the other country and he could not come to America. So this was a couple that was married and they were separated. And then my friend's in-laws are like, oh, but that's so terrible. While they probably would have been supportive of voting for things that would have put this in place. It's like,
right.
Oh, but this individual is so nice. And I feel like that's a problem some groups of us fall into, where it's thinking about things on almost too personal level without thinking about the greater implications for a community. Is it because we don't know people in other communities? Well, let's make some more friends.
Right. Then you call them your one friend, right? You're like, right. I have one friend that's like this. Yeah.
But I feel like that's the problem with exceptionalism. Well, I know one Black person, or I know one Muslim, and they're great, but the rest of them not so much, and I don't want to do anything for them. And I'm like, well, that's just really problematic.
Yeah.
And I feel like that actually is a legitimate problem. I forget the study, but it basically says that people can know individuals, and no matter how great an individual may be or how exceptional that person may be, that it will be seen as an exception to the rule rather than normative. So it's hard to get someone to have an interaction that changes their perception of the lot, which is really problematic. So it's like, how do you overcome science and like confirmation bias? Inverse of that is if you hear a story of criminality in a certain community where you expect it, then that is the confirmation bias. And it's, oh, well, obviously, because that's such and such group. And it's like, no.
You're like, hold on. Can we reverse this? Can we reverse how this happened? Can we be aware of this? Yeah, I will say personally, I remember growing up in a predominantly white town. And I passed as white, especially in the winter when my skin is not as tan. And I remember one of my friends, I played soccer with her for years, and my father is from Haiti, and he is a dark-skinned Black man. So you know my father's Black, and therefore you know that I am Black. And I remember her telling me that her uncle, and she lived with him, did not like Black people. And she said this to my face, and I was like, whoa. And we were in middle school. And so I just remember being like, breathe through it, but trying to keep my cool and allowing this conversation to happen, because I actually felt as though, whether her tact was there or not, that it was something she was trying to talk through. She didn't have a space to talk about it, and she felt our friendship was a safe space to talk about it. And I had said, you know, I'm Black, right? You know, my dad's Black, right? And her response in the wonderful exceptionalism dynamic was, yeah, but you're a good one though. And I just remember feeling like, ooh, well, I want to scream at the top of my lungs right now, but I also know that won't help any aspect of this conversation from moving forward in a productive way. And unfortunately, it's like, so I either have the opportunity to really express myself and potentially hurt my good status, or I have to say nothing. Weirdly, by saying nothing, it feels as though I'm telling her it's such a blessing that your uncle thinks I'm a good one. Like, oh, so yeah, there is this whole dynamic that is incredibly disturbing and so unfortunate, because what is it really? If you actually had the opportunity to be around people and you didn't have to bucket each other by whatever label it is, by race, by whatever, and actually experiencing that human, would you determine them differently? I mean, again, I'm living in this rosy colored glasses world of let's rewind all of history and the oppression that's happened and let's all be great together. But there is this part of it that's like, if we want to act like we're in a colorblind society or in a post Martin Luther King society, we have to be able to have discourse where you tell me I'm a good person and I say that's bullshit, right? I have to be able to come back and say, hold on, I'm not trying to hurt you here. I want this conversation to keep going, but I have to, in the same way we were talking about, we have to say that doesn't belong here. I have to be able to say that back to you and not have it be some implosion of a relationship, but really setting a boundary there.
Well, I remember when I was in high school, a girl I had known from elementary school. We lived in the same neighborhood and we were really good friends. And we were talking, and she was talking about myself and another friend of mine who's also Black. And she was like, our other friend, I think of her as half white. And you, I think of you as white. And I don't remember my response was, but it was just so memorable to me. I was like, what? The way she said it was clearly supposed to be a compliment or neutral. It was like neutral or a compliment. It wasn't an insult. That was clear. But I was like, but that's not what I
And really, part of you wants to then say, because I've been told by many people that I am the whitest Black person they know, or they are Blacker than me. And I'm always like, huh? So there's a part of me that's like, okay, cool. What does that mean? What does me being the whitest person mean? What characteristics make me that? Because I'd love to hear what that means to you. I don't think it has anything to do with the color of my skin or the color of your skin. There is some quality that you're saying is more white. And what does that mean, right? Because then you get to the meat of it, to understanding where that came from.
I hate the word fair because obviously life's not fair, but I'm going to use it anyway. I think one of the things that's not fair in this conversation is that as a society, we don't necessarily talk about what white culture is. We have like American culture, maybe, or we have other subcultures, like the supposed Black culture. Like, what is that? Black culture is not a monolith, or Black people are not a monolith. But we never talk about whiteness. And so I feel like people default into, well, whatever place we're in, this is what it is. It's like, but let's talk about what we're actually not talking about.
Also, when you're defining it for me, right? You're telling me one thing. Your friend is telling you that you are white. Something in your mind has identified what that is. But then it's like, oh crap, I said that out loud and there's words that I have to put to that. And that's really difficult. It's such an interesting juxtaposition because the part of that was so interesting and so familiar in like my gut was that I said it and you should feel so good about it. Right? You should be so happy that I said, like, that was a compliment. It's like,
I've extended something to you.
Favor. Oh, thank you? No, I'm not going to say thank you. You can keep that. Thank you very much. So one of the things I'm just going to pivot us into a little bit here is one of the questions that I ask in every one of my episodes. Do you mind sharing a story of when you have felt different or other, aside from the fact that somebody told you that you were white when you were like, well, no. Do you have any experiences in your life where you have felt different or other that have stuck with you?
Well, here's one where I think I felt internally more different that is relevant to what we've been talking about childhood stuff. And then I'll try and think of a later life example. When I was in middle school, a friend of mine who was white had a sleepover birthday party. And I was invited and we were friends and everything was good. And I spent the night at her house and nothing at all bad or negative happened to me. We all ate the food and watched Deep Impact or whatever it was, some dramatic DVD. But what I remember about that night, and I remember feeling weird about not knowing what was going to happen. And then it was also strange, nothing happened to me. But that night, me and a bunch of girls slept in sleeping bags or blankets or whatever it was on the floor. And then on the wall was literally the entire wall of this game room was a Confederate flag. I slept underneath a Confederate flag. And I was like, the entire wall. It was the biggest flag I've ever seen of any type of flag. Yeah. It was the entire wall. And so that was an experience where when I immediately saw it, I felt othered. I was like, what's going to happen? And it's so surreal. When people talk about what the flag means, more like heritage and whatever, it clearly meant something different to her parents and me. But I don't recall being treated badly or this or that. But it was also interesting because they also had the self-awareness to not have it on the outside of their house. But that was a feeling of at least internal otherness.
Right. Again, there is a part of you that's like, even if I brought it up, it would be this idea of, it's my heritage. I'm just proud of my history. And you're like, well, that means something very different to me. And it means that I'm potentially not welcome here. All of your actions are telling me otherwise. But this flag has so much meaning that means one way or another, my existence is not okay. And there's a part of that that's so interesting. I'm not sure if this will be helpful to join in on the Confederate flag conversation. But I remember a couple of years ago, I was with a bunch of one of my closest friends, and I had traveled to North Carolina with her. We were on a trip, and it was right before Halloween. And we were talking about Halloween costumes. And somebody said that they were going to be dressed up as the Confederate flag.
What?
And I was just like, first of all, that's a costume. Second of all,
right.
What? Like, why? And it was like, I'm just going to play up the Confederate thing. And I just remember being like, do you understand what that means to other people? It's like, oh, it's just being proud of my Southern heritage. And I said, oh, And I knew, again, at this point, I didn't know these people super, super well, but I felt so uncomfortable because what I wanted to do was say, oh, your intention isn't to be racist, but the idea that this is such a sense of pride, and it's also kind of funny that it becomes a costume for you. It was kind of like my brain was going, cannot compute. Like, how do we work through this? So I can only imagine as a little girl sitting there in her sleeping bag being like, okay, I'm going to go to sleep. What do I do now?
Online, I came across a school, I think it was in Kansas. Yeah, I think it was Kansas, where there was a high school debate class that debated the flag. And what had happened was something at the school, and some students were like raising the Confederate flag, and it became like this whole issue in the school. And so the debate teacher allowed the class to have free-flowing, not in debate style, but just like, okay, we're going to have one person talk at a time. You can say what you want to say, and let's just hear each other's points. And it was so fascinating and so wild. And it was a very long conversation. It was probably at least an hour, but it was just, wow. It was like, it was a very recent conversation, like in the past couple of years. And I think it's really interesting when people talk about, it's just the next generation and racism will die out or whatever, but how people talk about things and what their intentions are may not necessarily be racist. And so the question is, well, what is it about the education, or what is it about our relations to different things? How does this still affect? And in the conversation, it seemed like the people who were very supportive of the Confederate flag had inherited a lot of sentimentality from their families.
Yeah.
And they really seemed to think the Civil War was about commerce and money and this and that, even though obviously the this and that and the commerce were human beings. The cognitive dissonance, or the inability or the lack of desire to really admit that was strong.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel like some of these things, to say it inarticulate, are very a lot. It's just like overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
you think of like the youth being like the next generation, they'll make things better, hopefully. And there are just so many conversations that I think society at all age level and generation levels needs to really have. And they're going to be very difficult. But it was so great that the teacher actually made space for the conversation to happen. Because I feel like so often it's like we're shouting at one another, and we're not listening. And I think having more spaces for civil discourse, and I'm not sure anyone's mind changed one way or the other, but I took the time, states away, to listen to people have this conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think if we can develop more spaces that aren't one-offs, then maybe we'll actually come to see each other better and understand what's really going on.
Yeah, there is this whole idea of like the children are our future, and being able to watch that teacher hold that safe space and those kids have discourse that wasn't disrespectful. They might not agree, but they're respectful of one another. And you would assume at that age, a lot of it's learned, and having the space to really gain some new education and not have it just be from the four walls that you lived in about this topic that has shaped a lot of our country's history. It's truly incredible. And I feel like, at least in the diversity and inclusion work that I do, I wish there was more room for that, room for conversation, room for people to say things that come out wrong and that aren't intended to do what they do, but the impact is right there in their face and they can't turn away from it. So you can really see when you do say something that might, in a room full of people, that it doesn't even phase at all, just go unnoticed and then become part of your normal script or your normal conversation, to see how something can impact another person. I think the same way in the fact that my jarring expression to the Confederate flag was responded to with, well, are you saying you don't like people that are Southern? And I was like, oh, whoops.
What?
I guess. But no, there is a part of it.
That is so interesting.
Right. Yeah. And there is a part of it that's like, you know what? I'm not taking, again, let me not say that my job is to take consideration of everybody else's and be quiet, because I've done a very good job of that my whole life. But I'm not necessarily giving the space to meet them where they are a little bit too. Yeah. I'm coming in and saying, you know what that is. And especially the word racist is such a charged word, and it shuts people down. It stops conversations and it puts guards up. And no matter how you define it, right? You can pull out the dictionary and read it. People aren't actually listening to those words. So really, to create a space that allows you to really express, this is what that flag means to me. I'm not here to tell you that that flag doesn't mean that to you. It does mean that to you, right? But what it is it means this to me, and this person will tell you it means that to them. And hopefully hearing and actually listening to those experiences add some complexity to what that symbol means.
Do you actually get that response, or is that the feared response that they would say it represents the South?
The response was that it's Southern heritage or something along those lines. And I was like, okay, well, I hear where that's coming from for you, but
Well, why that's surprising to me is that if whoever thinks it's like representative of Southern history is like, but what about the Black people in the South? Like my family, this used to be part of my Twitter bio. It's like 3/4 Southern. Like my grandparents, half of them from Arkansas, and then the other half are from like Jersey and Louisiana. I'm like 3/4 Southern. I'm like, no one in my family. It's like, oh, let me fly the Confederate flag. That's my heritage. It's not like I have plenty of Southern family, and that's not the vibe.
Thank you for saying that point. I think that that's very important to say. It's not just one group that gets to call someone Southern one way or another. It's what they call, right? It's the Mason-Dixon line is what most people would consider Southern. So it's not necessarily a flag that meant something else. So I know we talked about the youth of the world in that conversation in Kansas, but I'd love to hear, especially stepping into the role that you've stepped into recently and really bringing together the communities of Boston and being around people that are making change happen and being a fellow elder millennial with me, I believe you are. As millennials step into more leadership position and have more room for their voices to be heard on a larger scale, how do you see that landscape changing, whether it be in yourself or the people around you? I heard you talking about the fact that kids are having more exposure to different things now. And so in that classroom, they had the ability to really have more discourse than we're able to have if we haven't necessarily been exposed to people that are different than us. And the millennial generation in particular, the size of the millennial generation is that of the baby boomer, if not larger. But the actual breakdown of that group is a lot more diverse, both, from a racial perspective, beliefs perspective, just so many aspects of what make that generation what it is, or our generation what it is. There's a part of me that feels an inevitability of change in that. And I think we're already feeling a friction of new voices coming into the fold or new constituents demanding difference to be made within kind of our political structures, but our structures overall. So I'm just wondering, from one millennial to another, how you see, even if it's on a small level of people in your life, how you see millennials making change happen, or even just the mentality that comes with having the internet at your fingertips in some pretty years,
Well, demographics are changing. So I think leadership is changing in lots of different organizations and different fields. Not that they're all millennials, but even looking at the demographics of Boston City Council, there's certainly a lot of change happening. Most of the members of Boston City Council are actually Black women, and that's incredible. So that's exciting. There is a lot of diversity within our age group, and now we're becoming parents, so maybe we'll be more invested in school systems, which is great. I mean, if I could change only one thing about American society, I would change what we're taught in school. My hope, my very idealistic, bookish hope is that if we taught American history more accurately, we would be a more informed and compassionate nation. I think that would make a world of difference. So maybe as we keep advocating for things we think are important, we can really make inroads into education and bear some of these fruits. One of my fears for American society would be, even as we become more diverse, if power or money stays concentrated in the places where it is without any changes towards equity, then we'll have a very lopsided power structure. For better or worse, when the country has been majority white and majority of white people have had all power and money, numerically that could kind of make sense, one could argue. But as we become more diverse, if that doesn't shift, what will that inequality look like, feel like? How long will we stand for something that is so lopsided? I feel like that's what we're in the middle of now, where it's like, now we're actually starting to talk about the statistics. We're starting to understand the numbers. We're starting to really question why things the way they are. But if we don't actually change anything, then I feel like that's a very dangerous place where people will become very angry if it becomes too lopsided. We've seen it in lots of countries across the world. So to avoid that sort of thing, I think we should really look at what we're doing. If we don't really address some of these central issues of inequality and wealth, that is very problematic for our future, because other countries have turned to violence as things got very inequitable. And so hopefully we can use the powers of our democracy to come up with a thoughtful solution.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Barron's had a conference, and this demographer actually went through the breakdown of the various generations and how the shift is taking place and how quickly it's taking place. And one of the big aspects that he talked about was, if we don't get on board with being more inclusive in our societal structures, economically, we won't be able to withstand the level of superpower. If our systems don't become more inclusive, we won't have the actual people to have our economy moving forward in the way we'd like to remain the United States that we know today. day on a global scale. So it's a really important thing to acknowledge that what you were just talking about. It's like, it's great for us to have this conversation. It's great for us to become more informed as a nation. It's wonderful that we have the ability to have this information at our fingertips. But there is this part of it that if the structures, if the power is not actually acknowledged, it's not just the people that aren't getting equal treatment that are going to be upset. Across the board at some point, that inequality and that lopsidedness will impact everybody. I am no fortune teller here, but there is a part of it where when you do look at the data and the numbers that we have available now, like it was this kind of meta idea for a while that you could kind of feel this shift. You knew that you had more people that you would see around that looked different than you. There were more people stepping into positions. You're talking about the city council being a majority Black women. Like these are incredibly beautiful things that are happening. But when you don't have the data points, a lot of times people don't listen. Again, there's this exceptionalism dynamic that's like, oh, well, that just happened there, right? Mm-hmm. But when you have the data points to say, here's the population of this country and here's how it's going to move forward. This is the group that was born in this country, right? So in 25, 30 years, they will be a significant part of the economic structure. And if they are not given the opportunity to succeed and thrive, our economy will not succeed and thrive. Thrive. So you're not going to all of a sudden inject more people in. They're not here. So it's this whole idea. I think it's beautifully said that it's re-educating ourselves and really coming to terms with where we are right now and what not 5 years looks like, but what 10, 15 years looks like, what 20 years looks like if we don't come to terms with the reality of this imbalance. Woo, I like this, girl. We should talk all the time. Well, I'm going to say this part. I'm going to go on this side of it. What gives you hope right now? I feel like some of this felt kind of hopeful to me, even though we're talking about some pretty deep, pretty heavy stuff. What gives you hope? It could be something big or small.
What gives me hope is that across different industries, more people are actually talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity. There are certainly plenty of challenges because in some industries, these are very nascent conversations. And so there are struggles with talking about things that people are not comfortable or familiar with talking about, but that there are so many people and organizations that want to have these conversations, I find to be very inspiring.
I like that. Heck yeah. And one of the reasons that I started this podcast is that I have felt that work can be a really difficult place to actually have these conversations while still being worried about, being employed and working with these people at the end of the day and having your manager give you assignments. There's a lot on the line when these things are very triggering for people at times. And one of the things that I wish we had more opportunity for was this kind of conversation and discourse and the ability to kind of sit in it and actually process it and not have to respond right away in a training. Because I have found it's a really difficult thing, both as the person trying to hold the safe space and a person trying to have the conversation. Sometimes you need a moment to think about what information you just heard, what you just learned, or reflect on the things about yourself that you never even thought about, or you activated the idea that there is bias within you. So I am very hopeful about that too. And I'm hopeful that we will find multiple ways to let that growth happen, because not everybody learns in the same way. Not everybody grows in the same way. So I like this part. So if you already talked about the one thing you would change in the world. That's one of my favorite questions. We talked about kind of the education system and how we approach education here of American history and like the full breadth of American history. But I am going to just hop on over to some visioning because I love visioning. The coach in me loves visioning. So what does the next year look like for you, and what are you the most excited about?
This next year, I feel like you really reminded me of some of my past goals. So this year, I'm really going to challenge myself to write more for public consumption. So thank you for letting me know that you were reading my stuff. I'm like, okay, maybe I should actually do this more. It's something I want to do. So let me actually do it. So that's one goal. And then the other thing is that I guess kind of coming full circle in this conversation, I am actually getting married this summer, and my fiance also did the Peace Corps, and we've met each other through the network. So it all comes together.
Oh, that is so cool. So first of all, I just need to say the fangirl in me just got so excited that you said you're writing some more. So I will be like chomping at the bit as you post more stuff. So yes, please, and yes, please. And yahoo for getting married. This is so exciting. Yeah, this year's going to be amazing. Come on now. Well, thank you for taking the time tonight. I appreciate it so very much.
Thank you. No, it was a pleasure. I had a blast.
We'll have to do it again.
Yes, please.
All right. Thanks, Court.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay. So how great was that conversation? You made it to the end, so I think you liked it too. Be sure, if you haven't already, to subscribe to this podcast. And I mentioned it so many times up front, but if you don't already follow me on social media, please head on over to Facebook, to Instagram, to Twitter, or even to LinkedIn to give me a follow, because I will keep you updated on all the wonderful things that we have going on over here. I appreciate your ears and your attention, and I cannot wait to drop the next episode in 2 weeks. If you were one of the lucky ones to get a ticket to TEDxBU, hopefully I will get a chance to see you there. Talk to you all soon.